By the time I turned 25, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt reliable, almost rehearsed. I shared a modest apartment with Daniel Moore, my boyfriend of 2 years, in a quiet neighborhood where evenings were predictable and mornings rarely rushed. Daniel liked routine, early alarms, black coffee, folded laundry, and I liked that about him. Stability had a way of convincing you that nothing important was missing. I worked as a junior editor at a local publishing firm, a job that rewarded patience more than ambition. Daniel worked longer hours in finance, often coming home with loosened ties and a distant smile that suggested exhaustion rather than disinterest. We cared for each other in practical ways, groceries remembered, messages checked in, plans made weeks in advance. Love, I told myself, didn't need to be loud. If Daniel was the structure of my life, Lucas Reed was its constant motion. Lucas had been my best friend since university, quick-witted, observant, and effortlessly present. Where Daniel planned, Lucas improvised. Where Daniel listened quietly, Lucas asked questions that cut straight to the truth. He had a way of leaning into conversations, elbows on the table, eyes steady, as if whatever you were saying mattered more than anything else around us. Lucas and I talked almost every day. Sometimes it was a quick exchange of jokes, sometimes long calls that stretched late into the night. Daniel never objected. He trusted me, and Lucas had always been part of the landscape of my life. Introducing them years ago had felt natural, even necessary. They were friendly, polite, and comfortably distant, two separate worlds that met only through me. On weekends, Daniel and I often stayed in. He preferred quiet nights, documentaries, and takeout eaten straight from the box. I didn't mind, not really. Still, there were moments when I noticed how easily my phone found its way into my hand, how instinctively I checked for Lucas's messages. With Lucas, conversation felt weightless. With Daniel, it felt careful, as if we were both afraid of disturbing something fragile we couldn't name. Lucas noticed things. He noticed when I hesitated before answering questions about my day, when my laughter softened too quickly. He never pushed, never demanded explanations. He simply stayed available, and that availability became a kind of comfort I didn't examine too closely. One evening, after Daniel fell asleep early on the couch, I stepped onto the balcony with my phone. The city hummed below, distant and indifferent. Lucas called, his voice low and familiar, and asked how I was really doing. I gave him the honest version, the one that didn't fit neatly into Daniel's quiet routines. Lucas listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said, "You don't sound unhappy. Just unfinished." The word lingered after the call ended. Unfinished. I told myself he was reading too much into things, that long friendships invited overinterpretation. Yet I replayed his tone, the careful concern beneath it, and wondered when he had learned to hear the things I didn't say. Daniel and I continued as we always had. We planned a short trip for the following month, discussed furniture we might replace someday, spoke casually about the future as if it were already agreed upon. But beneath those conversations, something had shifted, not dramatically, not yet. It was more like the quiet awareness of a draft in a closed room. Lucas started inviting me out more often, casual suggestions framed as afterthoughts. Coffee, a walk, a quick drink after work. I declined more than I accepted, reminding myself that balance mattered. Still, I noticed how easily my mood lifted when his name appeared on my screen, how natural it felt to tell him things before I told anyone else. One night, as Daniel slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the people who knew me best. I had always assumed the answer was simple. Lying there, listening to Daniel's steady breathing, I realized it wasn't. The comfort I trusted, the friendship I leaned on, both were real, both were important. I just hadn't considered what might happen if they began to overlap in ways I could no longer ignore. The change didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as busyness and good intentions. Daniel started coming home later than usual, his phone pressed to his ear even as he kicked off his shoes. When he spoke, it was in fragments, updates about meetings, deadlines, numbers that meant nothing to me. I listened, nodded, and waited for the moment when he might ask about my day. Often, it never came. I told myself it was temporary. Daniel had always been ambitious, and I admired that about him. Still, the apartment felt different in the evenings, as if the walls absorbed his absence and reflected it back at me. Silence filled spaces where conversation used to live. That was when Lucas became louder in my life, though he never raised his voice. He noticed my delayed replies, the shorter messages, and called instead. "You sound tired," he said one night, not accusing, just observant. I laughed it off, but the truth pressed against my chest, heavy and persistent. We began meeting more often after work. Nothing dramatic, coffee shops, quiet streets, places where conversation mattered more than spectacle. Lucas listened the way he always had, but now his attention felt sharper, more focused. When I spoke about Daniel, Lucas didn't criticize him. He asked careful questions instead, ones that forced me to examine feelings I had been skimming past. I didn't intend to compare them, but the contrast became unavoidable. Daniel loved me through plans and commitments. Lucas loved me through presence. That realization unsettled me, because it suggested a hunger I hadn't admitted existed. One evening, Lucas pointed out that I smiled less when I talked about home. I denied it too quickly, and he noticed that too. His silence afterward wasn't judgmental, it was thoughtful. "You don't have to explain anything to me," he said finally. "I just want you to be honest, with yourself, at least." Honesty felt dangerous. It required acknowledging that I was sharing parts of myself with Lucas that I no longer shared with Daniel. Late-night conversations replaced early mornings. Emotional reactions were filtered through Lucas first, Daniel second. I began leaving out details when Daniel asked who I'd been with, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because explaining felt complicated. The guilt crept in slowly. It surfaced when I muted my phone so Daniel wouldn't see Lucas's name light up the screen, when I stepped into another room to answer calls. I told myself privacy wasn't secrecy, that friendships deserved space. Still, the justifications sounded thinner each time I repeated them. Lucas never crossed a line, but he stood close enough to make me aware of where the line was. His concern felt personal now, tinged with something unspoken. I noticed it in the way he held eye contact a moment longer, in the pauses that stretched between sentences. There was restraint there, deliberate and careful, and that restraint made everything feel heavier. Daniel sensed the distance before I did. He asked if something was wrong, his voice cautious, as if afraid of the answer. I reassured him quickly, too quickly, and watched relief soften his expression. The ease with which he accepted my words unsettled me more than suspicion would have. One night, after another late dinner eaten alone, I scrolled through old photos on my phone, college memories, group outings, moments frozen in time. Lucas appeared in more of them than I remembered. We had always been close. The difference now was that closeness demanded attention. A message from Lucas arrived just after midnight. "Can we talk tomorrow?" Just us. There was nothing dramatic about the words, yet my pulse quickened as I read them. I stared at the ceiling, the familiar shape of Daniel asleep beside me, and felt the weight of choices I hadn't made but was already living with. The next day stretched endlessly. I moved through work on autopilot, aware that something was approaching, though I couldn't name it yet. Whatever Lucas wanted to say, I knew it wouldn't fit neatly into the life I'd been protecting. That evening, as I left the office and checked my phone again, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. The distance between friendship and betrayal isn't always marked by action. Sometimes, it's defined by anticipation. I met Lucas at a small park a few blocks from my office, a place neither of us had any real attachment to. The neutrality felt intentional, as if we both understood that whatever happened there shouldn't be tied to memory or comfort. The late afternoon sun filtered through bare branches, casting uneven shadows on the bench where he was already waiting. Lucas stood when he saw me, then hesitated, unsure whether to step closer. That pause told me more than any greeting could have. We exchanged a few ordinary words, how work had been, how cold the air felt, but they landed awkwardly between us, fragile and hollow. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Lucas stared at the ground, his hands clasped tightly, and I realized I had never seen him this restrained. He had always been expressive, quick to fill silence. Now, silence seemed to be doing the work for him. "I didn't ask you here to make things uncomfortable," Lucas said finally. His voice was steady, but there was strain beneath it. I just couldn't keep pretending everything was normal. My instinct was to reassure him, to smooth over whatever he was about to say, but something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a passing worry. It was deliberate. Lucas took a slow breath. "I need to be honest with you, Ethan. And I need you to hear me without trying to fix it." The request tightened something in my chest. I nodded, already bracing myself. I've had feelings for you for a long time, Lucas said. Longer than I should have. Longer than I admitted to myself. He didn't look at me when he spoke, as if meeting my eyes would make the words collapse. They didn't disappear when you started dating Daniel. They just went quiet. The world narrowed to the space between us. I had imagined many versions of this conversation during the day, but none of them prepared me for the calm in his confession. There was no urgency, no plea, only truth laid out carefully, like something fragile. Lucas continued, I tried to ignore it. I told myself being your friend was enough. But somewhere along the way, that stopped being true. He glanced up then, searching my face. And I hate that, because I respect your relationship. I respect you. I wanted to interrupt, to say something decisive, but my thoughts refused to organize themselves. Part of me wanted to deny everything, to insist he was mistaken. Another part recognized the familiarity of his words, the way they echoed feelings I had carefully avoided naming. When you started leaning on me more, Lucas said quietly, I told myself it was nothing. That friends do that, but I knew I was crossing a line emotionally, even if I never crossed it physically. Hearing him acknowledge that boundary made the guilt sharper. I hadn't imagined the shift. It had been mutual, unspoken, and therefore easier to excuse. This isn't fair to Daniel, Lucas added. And it's not fair to you. That's why I needed to say it out loud. I can't keep pretending my intentions are pure when they're not. I stared at my hands, the cold seeping through my coat. Daniel's face surfaced in my mind, his quiet trust, the ease with which he believed in us. The contrast between that certainty and the confusion I felt now made my chest ache. I don't expect anything from you, Lucas said quickly, as if sensing my turmoil. I'm not asking you to choose me. I just needed you to know why things feel different. Why I've been pulling closer instead of backing away. Quote, I finally looked at him, really looked. There was no hope in his expression, only vulnerability and restraint. That made everything harder. I don't know what to say, I admitted. The honesty felt inadequate, but it was all I had. I didn't realize how far things had gone until now. Lucas nodded, accepting that answer without protest. That's enough, he said. I didn't want a reaction. I wanted clarity. We sat there a moment longer, the confession settling between us like a weight neither of us could lift. When I stood to leave, Lucas didn't stop me. He simply said my name once, softly, as if committing it to memory again. As I walked away, the certainty I had relied on for years fractured. Nothing had physically changed, yet everything felt altered. The truth had been spoken, and I knew I couldn't return to ignorance, not with Daniel, and not with myself. The days after Lucas's confession passed in a blur of routine and reflection. I moved through my life as if nothing had changed, yet every familiar moment felt altered by what I now knew. Daniel talked about work, about plans for the weekend, about small inconveniences that once grounded me. I listened, answered when appropriate, and wondered how honesty could feel heavier than silence. At night, sleep came in fragments. I replayed Lucas's words, not because I wanted to encourage them, but because they had named something I could no longer ignore. The emotional closeness I had justified as harmless now demanded accountability. I hadn't touched Lucas, hadn't promised him anything, but I had given him parts of myself that belonged elsewhere. Daniel noticed the distance soon enough. He always had a quiet awareness of changes, even if he didn't confront them immediately. One evening, while we were washing dishes together, he turned off the water and asked, gently, are you still happy with me? The question landed harder than any accusation. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the trust I had been leaning on without earning. I didn't tell him about Lucas. That confession would have shifted the pain onto him without purpose. But I didn't lie either. I haven't been fully present, I said. And that's not fair to you. Daniel absorbed that in silence. He didn't raise his voice or demand explanations. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. I need to know you're choosing this, he said. Choosing us. That night, I realized choice wasn't a feeling. It was an action, one I had been avoiding by staying undecided. I met Lucas once more, briefly, in the same neutral space where everything had changed. This time, the conversation was shorter. I told him I needed distance, not as punishment, but as necessity. Lucas didn't argue. He accepted responsibility without dramatics, acknowledging that closeness without clarity had been a mistake we both made. I never wanted to be the reason you hurt someone, he said. I know, I replied. And I meant it. Walking away from Lucas felt like a quiet grief. There was no anger, no resentment, only the loss of something that might have been, had circumstances been different. That loss, I realized, was part of growing up. Not every feeling deserved to be followed. With Daniel, rebuilding wasn't immediate or effortless. Trust doesn't return simply because truth is partially told. I showed up more, spoke more honestly, resisted the urge to retreat into comfort when conversations became difficult. Some nights were tense, others tentative. But they were real, and that mattered. Still, something had shifted permanently. The version of myself who believed emotional loyalty was instinctive had been replaced by someone who understood its fragility. I learned that boundaries aren't defined by intent alone, but by attention, where it goes, and why. Weeks later, life began to steady again. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped pretending uncertainty could protect me. Lucas faded from my daily rhythm, not erased, but respectfully distant. Daniel remained, cautious yet present, and I worked to meet him where he was. On a quiet evening, sitting alone on the balcony where so many conversations had once begun, I thought about how easily life can change without visible disruption. No dramatic scenes, no irreversible acts, just a confession, and the honesty it demands.
I didn't regret hearing the truth. I regretted how long it took me to recognize my responsibility within it. Some stories don't end with clear answers or perfect outcomes. They end with awareness, with the understanding that love, in all its forms, requires intention as much as feeling. And sometimes, the most important choice isn't who you move toward, but who you decide not to betray.